Hi everyone, it's Trace here, the, as usual, air quotes, humorous tutor, and this video is an overview of the corticospinal pathways. So just to quickly break the term down, cortico meaning from the cortex and spinal in the spine, this pathway begins in the cortex of the cerebrum and ends in the spinal cord. So the corticospinal pathways are descending pyramidal pathways, and they're going to send out motor signals to innervate the skeletal muscles of the body. Because it's a motor pathway, there are three main regions on the frontal lobe of the brain where the signal originates. Firstly, on the precentral gyrus, we find the primary motor cortex. And just to keep things simple, from now on, I'll just say the signal comes from the primary motor cortex, though there are also inputs from the premotor cortex, and that's found a little bit more anteriorly, a little bit more laterally, whilst the supplementary motor area is found a little bit more medially and within the longitudinal fissure as well. So these are the three main regions that this signal for the corticospinal tract originates. Now, to understand the path which this pathway takes, I'm going to use these cross-sections to help us understand exactly which structures this pathway passes through. So up the top is the cerebrum, and then there are some cross-sections of the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and finally the spinal cord. And we'll just throw in a right and a left as well to help us out. Now, there are two corticospinal pathways. The first that I'm going to go through is the lateral. So, in the cerebrum, and I'm going to let's trace this one in blue. So the lateral corticospinal pathway in blue here, we start at the cerebrum, let's start on the right hand side, and that's where that signal originates. So this region here will correspond to the hand and feet region of the motor homunculus on the primary motor cortex. The path then descends through the corona radiata, through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and then into the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. From there, that'll continue descending into the anterior pons, and from there, it'll travel to the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, hence a pyramidal tract. Now, what's important here is that at the level of the lower pyramids of the medulla, these fibers decussate, so they cross over to the other side, and then they enter the spinal cord, where they enter the lateral corticospinal tract, and I've outlined that in red here. At the appropriate level of the spinal cord, some of these fibers will exit the lateral corticospinal tract, which was the white matter column, and travel to the ventral horn of the grey matter. In the ventral horn of the grey matter, we find the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons, and that's where the synapse will occur. The lower motor neuron will then take that innervation to the distal limb muscles. And so I'll just draw in dotted blue here the corresponding pathway that originates from the left side of the cerebrum, and so we understand how the right and left distal limb muscles are innervated by this particular pathway. So that was the lateral corticospinal pathway. I hope that makes sense. I'll just get rid of the left side and then we can look at the next one. And the next corticospinal pathway is the ventral or the anterior corticospinal pathway. And I'll draw that in black here for better contrast. In the brain, so the cerebrum and all of the brain stem, the ventral corticospinal pathway takes a very, very similar route. So we begin again at the cerebrum, but this time at the trunk region of the motor homunculus, again through the corona radiata, through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and down through the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. Again, through the anterior pons, and entering the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. However, as these fibers exit the brainstem to enter the spinal cord, they do not decussate, so they remain ipsilateral, and they enter the ventral corticospinal column, and you can see that circled in orange there. So note the difference in location of these white matter tracts in the spinal cord. Again, let's have a look at the lower motor neuron innervation here. So at the appropriate level of the spinal cord, the anterior corticospinal fibers actually innervate both the ipsi and contralateral lower motor neuron. Okay. So the right cerebral cortex there actually controls both the right and the left motor neuron. And this lower motor neuron is then going to supply or innervate the trunk and axial muscles. So muscles of the trunk and muscles of the proximal limbs in roughly the regions of the girdles. And I'll just draw in again on the left side. So then again, the left is just going to travel down the left side of the central nervous system, and then at the level of the spinal cord where appropriate, it will provide innervation to both the right and the left motor neuron. Okay. So the significance of this is, let's envision that there was a lesion at the internal capsule on the right side. So I've just drawn that in red there. So then we trace that down, and what that means is we're actually going to knock out the right lateral corticospinal upper motor neuron, like so. And so we're going to trace that down in blue, we're knocking all of that out, and therefore, because it's decussated at the medulla oblongata, then we actually lose innervation to the distal limb muscles. We lose the upper motor neuron there. We also lose the upper motor neuron that travels down the ventral corticospinal pathway. However, in green, sorry, that green's not easy to see, but in green, on the left side, that ventral corticospinal pathway is still fine. Therefore, we're actually not going to see much of an effect of this lesion on the trunk or the axial muscles. I hope that makes sense. So understanding where the lesion is and the consequent pathway that's affected, but also the pathway that's not affected, and therefore what would result. So to just sum up, in blue we had the lateral corticospinal pathway, and that provided innervation to the distal limb muscles, and this is voluntary control of skeletal muscles. This particular pathway, these fibers decussate at the lower pyramid, which means they cross over from right to left and left to right. And lastly, the lower motor neuron of this pathway is going to receive contralateral cortical innervation. So the left distal limb muscles are innervated by the right side, and vice versa, the left distal limb muscles are going to receive upper motor neuron signal that originates at the left primary motor cortex. In black, we had the anterior or the ventral corticospinal pathway. It takes the same path, except the lower motor neurons that it innervates are going to travel to the trunk and the axial muscles. It doesn't decussate at the level of the medulla oblongata. Rather, the upper motor neuron is going to provide bilateral cortical innervation to the lower motor neuron. So the right trunk and or axial muscles are going to receive innervation from both the right and the left side of the brain, and same for the left. Thank you for watching this video on the overview of the corticospinal pathways. I hope that made sense. If you've got any questions, please feel so free to ask. And until then, we will see you next time.